I'm Admiral Claudia Preston, 46 years old, and I worked my way up from an enlisted clerk to commanding fleets across 3 oceans. For years, I gave everything to my family, especially my father, hoping one day he'd see my worth. But when he laughed at a dinner table full of guests and said, "She's just a clerk. She'll never be anything more," I made a choice that changed everything. Have you ever been dismissed or humiliated by someone you gave everything to? If so, tell me your story in the comments. You're not alone. Before I dive into what happened, let me know where you're watching from. And if you've ever had to stand tall and claim your respect after being underestimated, hit like and subscribe for more true stories about boundaries and self-worth. What happened next might surprise you. I could live without his approval. I couldn't live without my own self-respect. 3 months later, the promotion opportunity arrived. I was serving as executive officer aboard the USS Constellation when Captain Gonzalez called me to his quarters. The conversation was brief but significant. My name had come up for consideration for promotion to Rear Admiral, a rank achieved by less than 1% of naval officers. The selection process would be rigorous, involving multiple boards and extensive review of my service record. "You've earned this consideration," Captain Gonzalez said, reviewing the paperwork spread across his desk. "Your leadership during the typhoon relief operations, your management of the joint training exercise with the Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force, your development of the new logistics protocols, it's all been noted by the right people." The promotion wasn't guaranteed. The Navy's flag officer selection process was notoriously competitive, with dozens of qualified candidates competing for each position. But being selected for consideration was itself an honor, recognition that my superiors believed I had the competence and character necessary for senior command. I should have been excited. This was the opportunity I'd worked toward for 2 decades, the culmination of countless deployments, difficult decisions, and professional sacrifices. Instead, I found myself thinking about my father, wondering how he would react to the news. The old version of myself would have called him immediately, hoping this achievement might finally earn the respect that had eluded me for so long. But the clarity I'd gained during our lunch meeting held firm. His approval or disapproval was irrelevant to the value of what I had accomplished. I focused on the selection process itself, which required months of preparation and evaluation. The review board examined every aspect of my service record, conducted extensive interviews with former commanding officers, and assessed my fitness for the strategic responsibilities that came with flag rank. The process was exhausting but fair, based entirely on merit and demonstrated competence. This was evaluation by people who understood my field, who could assess the significance of my achievements because they had faced similar challenges themselves. The contrast with my father's dismissive commentary was stark. When the notification came, I was alone in my quarters, reviewing operational reports late at night. The message was formal but clear. I had been selected for promotion to Rear Admiral. The ceremony would be held in 6 weeks at the Naval Academy, with family and colleagues invited to witness the traditional protocol. I sat staring at the screen for several minutes, absorbing the magnitude of what had just happened. Admiral. The rank carried weight and responsibility that extended far beyond individual achievement. It represented trust from the highest levels of naval leadership, confidence in my ability to make decisions that affected national security and international relations. My first instinct was to share the news with people who would understand its significance. I called Captain Rodriguez, my former commanding officer, who had become a mentor and friend over the years. His reaction was immediate and genuine. "Outstanding," he said, his voice carrying the warmth of someone who had watched my career develop from its early stages. "You've earned every bit of this. The Navy is getting a flag officer who knows how to lead." I called several other colleagues, each of whom responded with a kind of enthusiasm and respect that validated years of hard work. These were people who understood the demands of naval service, who could appreciate the complexity of reaching flag rank in a competitive and demanding profession. Eventually, I had to decide whether to tell my family. The question occupied my thoughts for days. The old patterns were still there, the ingrained desire for parental approval that persists even when logic suggests it's futile. Part of me wanted to believe that this achievement might finally break through my father's dismissive attitude, that the title of Admiral might command the respect that previous ranks had failed to earn. But I had learned to be honest about my father's limitations. His reaction to my previous promotion suggested he would find a way to minimize this one as well. He might focus on the military's bureaucratic nature, suggesting that promotion was automatic rather than competitive. He might emphasize the temporary nature of military rank, implying that real success required building something permanent in the civilian world. After a week of internal debate, I made the decision to invite them to the ceremony. Not because I expected his approval, but because the moment belonged to me, not to him. His reaction couldn't diminish what I had accomplished or change what the promotion represented. The phone call was as awkward as I'd anticipated. I delivered the news simply and directly, explaining that I had been selected for promotion to Rear Admiral and that the ceremony would be held at the Naval Academy. The silence lasted long enough that I wondered if the connection had been lost. When my father finally spoke, his tone was carefully neutral. "That's quite an achievement," he said, the words sounding rehearsed and distant. "I'm sure you're pleased with the recognition." Recognition. As if the rank of Admiral were equivalent to an Employee of the Month award, a nice gesture from management rather than one of the most significant appointments in military service. My mother was more enthusiastic, asking questions about the ceremony and expressing genuine pride in what I had accomplished. But even her excitement was tempered by years of following my father's lead in family discussions about my career. The conversation ended with polite promises to attend the ceremony and congratulations that felt obligatory rather than heartfelt. I hung up the phone feeling oddly empty, as if I had just shared momentous news with strangers who were trying to be polite about something they didn't understand. But the emptiness was different from the disappointment I'd felt after previous interactions with my father. This time, I had expected nothing and received nothing, which felt like a kind of victory. I was no longer surprised by his inability to celebrate my achievements, no longer wounded by his refusal to acknowledge their significance. The weeks leading up to the ceremony were filled with practical preparations and professional obligations. I coordinated with my new staff, reviewed the strategic responsibilities that came with flag rank, and prepared for the transition to a level of leadership that would affect thousands of sailors and millions of dollars in resources. The magnitude of the promotion began to sink in during these conversations with senior leadership. I would be responsible for major strategic decisions, diplomatic relationships with foreign navies, and the readiness of entire fleets. The trust being placed in me was extraordinary, earned through decades of proven competence under increasingly challenging circumstances. My father's opinion of this appointment was irrelevant to its actual significance. The Navy's most senior leaders had reviewed my record and determined that I possessed the judgment, expertise, and character necessary for flag rank. Their assessment was based on objective criteria and professional evaluation, not personal bias or limited understanding. As the ceremony approached, I felt a growing sense of anticipation that had nothing to do with my family's attendance. This moment represented the culmination of everything I had worked toward, validation from the institution I had served faithfully for 2 decades. Whether my father could recognize that validation was his limitation, not mine. The night before the ceremony, I stood in my hotel room reviewing my remarks for the following day. The words reflected on service, leadership, and the responsibility that came with flag rank. They were honest words about duty and dedication, about the honor of serving something larger than individual ambition. I thought about the sailors who had served under my command over the years, about the trust they had placed in my leadership and the responsibility I had felt for their safety and development. I thought about the complex operations we had executed successfully, the diplomatic relationships we had maintained, the humanitarian missions that had saved lives and provided hope in desperate situations. This was what leadership looked like in the modern Navy. It required technical expertise, strategic thinking, cultural sensitivity, and the ability to make critical decisions under pressure. It demanded sacrifice from families, dedication beyond normal working hours, and commitment to principles that transcended personal ambition. My father had never asked about any of these aspects of my career. He had never inquired about the weight of command, the complexity of international relations, or the satisfaction of developing young leaders. His questions, when he bothered to ask them, focused on logistics and administration, as if the Navy were simply a large corporation with unusual uniforms. But tomorrow's ceremony wasn't about his understanding or approval. It was about recognition from people who did understand, who could assess the true significance of what I had accomplished because they had walked similar paths themselves. The morning arrived crisp and clear, perfect weather for an outdoor ceremony. I dressed carefully in my service dress blues, adjusting the ribbons and insignia that told the story of 2 decades in uniform. Each decoration represented a specific achievement, a moment when my performance had exceeded expectations or contributed to mission success. Looking in the mirror, I saw someone I recognized and respected. The woman staring back at me had earned her place through competence and dedication, had proven herself in challenging circumstances, had gained the trust and confidence of her peers and superiors. My parents arrived at the Naval Academy looking appropriately dressed, but uncomfortable, like tourists visiting an unfamiliar culture. They followed the directions to the ceremonial hall, taking their seats among the families and colleagues who had gathered to witness the promotion. I watched them from across the room, noting my father's expression as he surveyed the gathering. Senior officers in dress uniforms, distinguished guests from various allied nations, media representatives covering the ceremony. This was a different world from his business dinners, more formal and traditional, governed by protocols he didn't understand. The ceremony began with traditional military precision. The honor guard presented colors, the Navy band played ceremonial music, and the presiding officer delivered remarks about the significance of flag rank and the responsibilities it entailed. When my name was called, I stepped forward and stood at attention while my previous commanding officers spoke about my service record and fitness for promotion. Their words were specific and substantive, citing particular operations and leadership decisions that had contributed to mission success. Captain Rodriguez spoke about my performance during a complex evacuation operation in the Western Pacific, describing how I had coordinated multiple assets to extract civilians from a dangerous situation while maintaining diplomatic relationships with several different governments. Admiral Chen discussed my role in developing new training protocols that had been adopted fleet-wide, improving readiness and safety standards across multiple ship classes. Captain Williams, my first commanding officer, talked about my growth from a junior officer into someone capable of handling the most challenging assignments the Navy could offer. These were people who understood the context of what I had accomplished, who could speak knowledgeably about the complexity and significance of my achievements. Their assessment carried weight because it was based on professional expertise and direct observation. The actual promotion was conducted according to centuries-old naval tradition. I raised my right hand and took the oath of office, promising to support and defend the Constitution and to faithfully discharge the duties of my new rank. Then came the moment I had been preparing for without fully understanding its impact. The presiding officer stepped aside, and the rear doors of the ceremonial hall opened. I heard the sound before I saw its source, the synchronized footsteps of a large formation moving in perfect unison. 200 Navy SEALs entered the hall in dress uniforms, their movements precise and coordinated. They filled the center aisle and formed ranks facing the platform where I stood. The sight was extraordinary. The Navy's most elite warriors gathered to honor a promotion they considered significant enough to warrant their presence. The senior SEAL officer called the formation to attention. The sound of 200 heels coming together echoed through the hall like a rifle shot. Then, in a voice that carried to every corner of the room, he called out the command I had been waiting 20 years to hear. Admiral. The word reverberated through the ceremonial hall as 200 hands snapped to salutes in perfect synchronization. The gesture was more than ceremonial courtesy. It was recognition from warriors who understood the meaning of leadership under pressure, who respected competence and dedication regardless of the specific nature of military service. I returned their salute, maintaining the bearing expected of a flag officer while processing the magnitude of what was happening. This wasn't just a promotion ceremony. It was validation from the most respected members of my profession, acknowledgement that I had earned my place among the Navy's senior leadership. The formation held their salutes for several seconds, the silence broken only by the click of cameras and the quiet sobbing of my mother, who had finally grasped the significance of what she was witnessing. When the SEALs dropped their salutes and filed out of the hall, the audience erupted in applause. The sound was thunderous, sustained, and genuine, the kind of response reserved for moments of real accomplishment and authentic respect. I looked out at the crowd, seeing faces I recognized and others I didn't, all united in their appreciation for what they had just witnessed. These were people who understood military service, who could appreciate the rarity and significance of reaching flag rank in the modern Navy. And then I looked at my parents. My mother was crying openly, her hands pressed to her mouth in amazement. She had finally seen her daughter through the eyes of people who understood what she had accomplished, and the recognition was overwhelming. My father sat beside her, but he might as well have been on another planet. His face was pale, his mouth slightly open, his eyes fixed on some point in the distance, as if he were trying to process information that didn't fit his understanding of reality. The wine glass in his hand trembled visibly, burgundy liquid spilling across his light gray suit jacket. He didn't seem to notice the stains spreading across the expensive fabric. His entire worldview had just been challenged by 200 of America's most elite warriors saluting his daughter as Admiral. For 20 years, he had described my career as clerical work, routine administration, glorified filing. He had dismissed my deployments as tourism, my leadership roles as supervisory positions, my achievements as participation awards. But the SEALs didn't salute clerks. They didn't honor administrators. They didn't show respect to people whose accomplishments were routine or insignificant. The contrast between his narrative and reality was too stark to ignore, too public to rationalize away. Everyone in that room had just witnessed 200 of the Navy's most elite personnel treating me with the respect reserved for senior military leadership. His wine glass slipped from nerveless fingers, shattering on the floor at his feet. The sound was lost in the continued applause, but I saw it happen. I watched my father confront the undeniable evidence that everything he had believed about my career was wrong. The ceremony concluded with traditional protocol and congratulations from various dignitaries. I shook hands with senior officers, accepted congratulations from foreign attaches, and posed for photographs that would document this milestone in my career. But throughout the reception that followed, my attention kept returning to my father. He moved through the crowd like someone in shock, responding to questions with mechanical politeness while his mind struggled to process what he had witnessed. People approached him with congratulations, praising him for raising such an accomplished daughter. Each comment seemed to deepen his confusion, forcing him to confront the disconnect between their assessment and his own. When we finally had a moment alone, he looked at me with an expression I had never seen before. Not pride exactly, but something closer to bewilderment mixed with the beginning of respect. "I had no idea," he said quietly, his voice barely audible above the reception noise. "I didn't understand." The words were inadequate, but they represented the first crack in 20 years of willful ignorance. Whether that crack would widen into genuine acknowledgement remained to be seen. But for the first time in my adult life, my father was looking at me without condescension, without dismissive commentary, without the smug certainty that he understood my world better than I did. The weeks following the ceremony brought a series of awkward attempts at reconciliation. My father called more frequently than he had in years, his conversations peppered with questions about my new responsibilities and comments that suggested he was trying to educate himself about military structure and protocol. The effort was genuine but clumsy. He asked about my staff size as if I were running a corporate division. He inquired about my territory of operations, using business terminology that didn't quite translate to naval command. He wanted to understand, but he was still trying to fit my world into frameworks that made sense to him. "How many people report to you now?" he asked during one of these conversations. "It's more complex than direct reporting relationships," I explained. I have operational command over multiple units, advisory responsibilities for strategic planning, and oversight duties that affect thousands of personnel across different commands. So you're like a regional vice president, he said, sounding pleased with himself for finding a comparison he could grasp. Regional vice president. The phrase made me smile despite myself. It was wrong, but it was progress. At least he was trying to understand instead of dismissing. My mother was more direct in her attempts to bridge the gap that had developed over the years. She called regularly, asking detailed questions about my work and sharing observations about my father's gradual awakening to what I had accomplished. He's been reading about the Navy, she told me during one conversation. There are books about naval history scattered around his office, and he's been watching documentaries about military leadership. I think he's trying to understand what he missed. What he missed. The phrase carried weight because it acknowledged that there had been something significant to miss. For 20 years, my father had been convinced that my career was unremarkable, that my achievements were routine, that my sacrifices were unnecessary. The ceremony had forced him to confront evidence that contradicted every assumption he had made about my life. But understanding the magnitude of his misunderstanding was different from accepting responsibility for it. In our conversations, he focused on his lack of knowledge rather than his active dismissal of my attempts to educate him. He framed his ignorance as innocent rather than willful, as if he had simply never had access to information about military service rather than consistently choosing to ignore or minimize it. The distinction mattered to me, though I wasn't sure it mattered to him. There was a difference between not knowing and not wanting to know, between ignorance and willful blindness. His reaction suggested he was still struggling to acknowledge which category his behavior had fallen into. I found myself in the strange position of having to decide how much effort to invest in this potential reconciliation. The old patterns were still there, his tendency to control conversations, to interpret my experiences through his own understanding, to position himself as the authority even when discussing topics he knew nothing about. But there were also genuine changes. He listened more carefully when I spoke about my work. He asked follow-up questions instead of changing the subject. He made an effort to remember details from previous conversations instead of treating each interaction as if it were our first discussion of my career. The progress was incremental and imperfect, but it was progress. 3 months after the ceremony, my father made an unexpected gesture. He invited me to lunch at his club, the exclusive downtown establishment where he conducted business with the city's most prominent leaders. This was his territory, the place where he was known and respected, where his opinions carried weight and his achievements were celebrated. But this time, he introduced me differently to the people we encountered. Instead of the dismissive descriptions I had grown accustomed to, he presented me as Admiral Claudia, emphasizing my rank in a way that commanded attention and respect from his associates. The change was subtle but significant. He was using his social influence to establish my credibility rather than undermine it, leveraging his reputation to enhance mine instead of diminishing it. Over lunch, he made an admission that surprised me with its directness. "I owe you an apology," he said, setting down his fork and meeting my eyes across the table. "I didn't understand what you were doing, and instead of asking questions or educating myself, I made assumptions. Those assumptions were wrong, and they were unfair to you." The words were carefully chosen, probably rehearsed, but they carried genuine weight. This was as close to accountability as I was likely to get from a man who had spent his life being right about everything. "I saw the way those SEALs looked at you," he continued. "I saw the respect in that room, the recognition from people who clearly understood something I didn't. I realized I had been judging your career based on my ignorance, not your accomplishments. It was a good apology. Better than I had expected and probably better than I deserved after years of justified resentment. But apologies, however sincere, couldn't undo decades of dismissive treatment or restore the relationship we might have had if he had chosen curiosity over condescension from the beginning." "I appreciate that," I said carefully. "But respect isn't something that can be restored with an apology. It has to be rebuilt through consistent actions over time." He nodded, accepting the condition without argument. "I understand. I'm hoping you'll give me the opportunity to try." The conversation marked a turning point, but it was the beginning of a process rather than the resolution of our problems. Trust, once damaged, required sustained effort to repair. Respect, once withdrawn, had to be earned again through demonstrated change in behavior. Over the following months, my father made consistent efforts to learn about my world and acknowledge my achievements. He asked thoughtful questions about naval strategy, international relations, and leadership challenges. He read books about military history and current defense issues. He made an effort to understand the context that gave meaning to my career. The changes were gradual but genuine. In family gatherings, he spoke about my promotion with obvious pride, sharing details about the ceremony and the significance of flag rank with relatives who had previously heard only dismissive comments about my phase in the military. His friends began to see me differently as well, responding to his changed attitude with questions and comments that reflected genuine interest in my experiences. The ripple effect worked in reverse. His respect influenced others to take me seriously in the same way his dismissal had once encouraged them to ignore my achievements. But the relationship remained careful and somewhat formal, bounded by the recognition that years of damage couldn't be undone quickly or completely. I maintained the emotional distance I had established to protect myself from his criticism, unwilling to risk the vulnerability that had been wounded so many times before. My father seemed to understand these boundaries, respecting my caution without pushing for more intimacy than I was prepared to offer. He had learned, perhaps, that rebuilding trust required patience and consistency rather than grand gestures or dramatic declarations. The process was imperfect and incomplete, marked by moments of genuine progress and occasional reversions to old patterns. But it was progress nonetheless, movement toward something that might eventually resemble mutual respect, if not the close relationship we had never quite managed to achieve. 5 years have passed since that ceremony, and the dynamics of my relationship with my father have settled into something neither of us would have predicted. We speak regularly now, conversations that focus on current events, military affairs, and the complex challenges of international security. He has educated himself enough to ask informed questions and offer thoughtful observations, though he's careful never to position himself as an expert on topics where my experience clearly exceeds his own. The change has been profound but not transformational. We have built a foundation of mutual respect that didn't exist before, but we haven't erased the history that shaped our relationship for so many years. Some damage runs too deep to be fully healed, some trust takes too long to rebuild completely. I think about that ceremony often, not just as a personal milestone, but as a moment of clarity that changed both of our lives. For me, it was validation from the people whose opinions mattered most, my peers, my subordinates, and the senior leadership who had observed my performance over 2 decades of service. For my father, it was a confrontation with evidence he couldn't dismiss or rationalize away. 200 Navy SEALs don't salute people whose accomplishments are routine or insignificant. They don't honor clerks or administrators or people who are just marking time until they find real careers. The sight of those warriors standing at attention, their synchronized salutes echoing through the ceremonial hall, had forced him to confront the possibility that his understanding of my career had been fundamentally wrong. That moment of recognition, the wine glass trembling in his hand, the stunned expression on his face, had been 20 years in the making. But the ceremony wasn't really about him, and my current career isn't really about our relationship. I command a fleet that operates across 3 oceans, coordinate with allied navies on matters of strategic importance, and make decisions that affect the security and readiness of American naval forces around the world. The work is demanding and complex, requiring the integration of tactical expertise, diplomatic sensitivity, and strategic thinking. Every day brings challenges that test my judgment, my leadership ability, and my understanding of international relations. The responsibility is enormous, the stakes are high, and the margin for error is small. This is what I worked toward for 20 years, not the title or the ceremonial respect, but the opportunity to serve at the highest levels of military leadership, to contribute to the defense of my country and the maintenance of international stability. My father's opinion of this work was never really relevant to its actual significance. His approval couldn't have made it more important, and his dismissal couldn't have made it less valuable. The meaning of my career was always determined by the people who understood it, who could assess its complexity and significance, because they had faced similar challenges themselves. The sailors who have served under my command know what leadership looks like under pressure. They've seen the decisions that have to be made when lives hang in the balance, the precision required to coordinate complex operations, the weight of responsibility that comes with flag rank. My peers in the international naval community understand the diplomatic complexities of maintaining alliance relationships while protecting national interests. They appreciate the strategic thinking required to position naval assets effectively, the cultural sensitivity needed to work with foreign partners, the technical expertise necessary to integrate modern warfare systems. Senior defense officials know the administrative and budgetary challenges of managing large military organizations, the political awareness needed to interact with civilian leadership, the communication skills required to explain military requirements to people who have never served in uniform. These are the people whose respect matters, whose opinions carry weight, whose assessment determines career advancement and professional opportunities. Their judgment is based on demonstrated competence, proven leadership, and measurable results under challenging circumstances. My father's gradual recognition of my achievements has been personally satisfying, but it hasn't changed the fundamental reality of what I accomplished or why it mattered. The ceremony that forced him to confront his misconceptions was meaningful because it represented validation from the military community, not because it finally impressed someone who had spent 20 years determined not to be impressed. I carry the rank of Admiral not for him, but for the institution I have served faithfully and the sailors who look to me for leadership and guidance. The title represents trust from people who understand what military service requires, confidence from leaders who have observed my performance under the most demanding circumstances. My father lives with the memory of that ceremony, the wine spilling across his jacket, the sight of 200 elite warriors saluting his daughter, the sound of Admiral echoing through the hall. It's a memory that probably haunts him occasionally, a reminder of how thoroughly he had misunderstood something that mattered deeply to someone he claimed to love. But I live with something more substantial and enduring. I live with the knowledge that I built a career based on merit, earned respect from people worth respecting, and proved that dedication and competence can overcome initial disadvantages and skeptical assumptions. The rank on my uniform tells a story of persistence through adversity, excellence under pressure, and leadership that inspired confidence from subordinates and superiors alike. It represents 2 decades of service to something larger than personal ambition, commitment to principles that transcended individual gain. My father's laughter at that long-ago dinner party has been replaced by respectful questions and genuine interest in my work. His dismissive comments about clerks and administrators have given way to careful acknowledgments of my expertise and achievements. But more importantly, his opinion no longer has the power to diminish my sense of worth or accomplishment. The validation I sought for so many years came from the right sources, the people who understood what I was trying to achieve and could assess whether I had achieved it successfully. The ceremony was a moment of public recognition, but it was also a moment of personal liberation. It freed me from the need to prove myself to someone who had never really wanted to see what I was capable of accomplishing. Today, I wake up each morning focused on the responsibilities that come with flag rank, the challenges of maintaining naval readiness in an increasingly complex world, the satisfaction of developing the next generation of military leaders. My father's respect, hard-won and carefully maintained, is a welcome addition to my life, but not a defining element of it. I learned, perhaps later than I should have, that some victories are worth fighting for and others are worth walking away from. The title of Admiral, the salutes of 200 SEALs, the trust of thousands of sailors, these things speak for themselves to people who matter. They don't require translation or interpretation or approval from someone who spent 20 years convinced they weren't worth celebrating. My name, my rank, and my service record remain as testimony to what dedicated people can accomplish when they commit themselves to excellence regardless of who is or isn't watching, who does or doesn't understand, who will or won't acknowledge the value of what they've achieved. That testimony speaks louder than any dinner conversation ever could. I grew up in a house where success was measured in quarterly reports and corner offices. My father had built his real estate empire from nothing, and he never let anyone forget it. The walls of our dining room were lined with awards, photos of him shaking hands with mayors and city council members, newspaper clippings celebrating another development deal. At dinner parties, he'd hold court at the head of our mahogany table, regaling guests with stories of his latest conquest in the commercial property market. I was the quiet one among 3 children. While my brothers played football and dated cheerleaders, I organized my father's files and helped my mother coordinate his business dinners. I was dependable. I showed up. I got things done without fanfare or recognition. When guests asked about his children, my father would beam about my brother's athletic scholarships and social achievements. About me, he'd say, "She's my little organizer." Always behind the scenes, keeping everything running smoothly. The phrase stung even then, though I couldn't articulate why. Behind the scenes. As if visibility was the only measure of value. When I announced my intention to join the Navy after high school, the dinner table fell silent. My father set down his fork and studied me with the same calculating expression he used when evaluating property investments. "The military," he said finally, "is fine for kids who don't have other options." My mother tried to soften the blow. "It's a good way to see the world, develop discipline." "It's a phase," my father concluded, cutting into a steak. "She'll do her 4 years, maybe meet a nice officer, and then settle into something more appropriate." Something more appropriate. The words followed me through basic training, through my first deployment, through the long nights standing watch in the Persian Gulf. I wrote letters home describing the complexity of naval operations, the precision required to coordinate multi-ship exercises, the weight of responsibility that came with every decision. My father's responses were polite but distant. He'd update me on property deals and my brother's careers, then sign off with generic well wishes. When I came home on leave, the dynamic was clear. My brothers commanded attention with their stories from college and early careers. I sat quietly, listening to conversations about stock portfolios and business strategies. When people asked about my service, my father would interject before I could respond. "She's doing well," he'd say. "Keeping busy with her duties." Her duties. As if military service was just another household chore. The disconnect deepened with each promotion. When I made lieutenant, my father acknowledged it with a brief nod and changed the subject. When I received my first commendation for excellence in logistics coordination, he glanced at the certificate and said, "That's nice, sweetheart." Very administrative. Administrative. The word became his favorite way to diminish everything I accomplished. Leading a team of 40 sailors became managing personnel. Coordinating supply chains for an entire battle group became handling paperwork. Earning the respect of seasoned officers became being helpful around the office. At family gatherings, his friends would ask about his children. He'd light up describing my oldest brother's law practice and my younger brother's success in medical school. When the conversation inevitably turned to me, his tone would shift to something approaching pity. "She's still in the Navy," he'd say, as if I were still recovering from a childhood illness. Doing her part, keeping the paperwork moving. The relatives would nod sympathetically, perhaps wondering why I couldn't find my way into something more substantial, more legitimate, more worthy of respect. I began to see our relationship as a ledger with only one column. I gave him years of my life in service to our country. I gave him pride in a daughter who had earned the trust of her superiors and the loyalty of her subordinates. I gave him sacrifice, missing holidays and birthdays and family milestones to fulfill my obligations half a world away. He gave me tolerance. Conditional acceptance. The kind of distant approval he might offer a neighbor's child who was trying her best at something he didn't quite understand. The imbalance was exhausting. During my second tour, I stopped sharing details about my assignments. Why describe the intricacies of fleet coordination to someone who saw it as glorified filing? Why explain the strategic importance of naval intelligence to someone who measured worth in office square footage? My mother noticed the growing distance. During our phone calls, she'd encourage me to be patient with him. "He just doesn't understand what you do," she'd say. It's so different from his world. But I was beginning to understand that this wasn't about comprehension. It was about respect. And respect, I was learning, was not something you could earn from people who had already decided you weren't worth it. My fellow officers saw something different. They saw competence, leadership, and dedication. They promoted me based on merit, not family connections or personal bias. They valued my contributions because those contributions mattered, because missions succeeded or failed based on the quality of my work. The contrast was stark. In uniform, I was someone worth listening to. At family dinners, I was someone to be politely endured. My father never asked about the weight of command, the pressure of making decisions that affected hundreds of lives, or the satisfaction of watching young sailors grow into capable leaders under my guidance. He never inquired about the countries I'd seen, the challenges I'd overcome, or the friendships I'd forged with people who understood the meaning of service. Instead, he'd ask when I planned to transition into something more stable. Stable. As if a career built on discipline, honor, and demonstrated competence was somehow precarious compared to his world of leveraged real estate deals and municipal politics. I stopped expecting his approval sometime during my third deployment. The revelation was both liberating and lonely. Liberating because it freed me from the exhausting cycle of hoping he'd finally see my worth. Lonely because every daughter wants her father's pride, even daughters who have learned to live without it. By the time I reached the rank of commander, our interactions had settled into a comfortable emptiness. He'd ask generic questions about my health and my living situation. I'd provide brief, polite answers. We'd exist in the same room without really seeing each other. The foundation was cracked beyond repair. I had spent years trying to prove myself worthy of his respect, never realizing that the problem wasn't my worth, it was his ability to recognize it. Some people measure value in familiar terms, and anything outside their experience becomes invisible, irrelevant, or insignificant. My father had built his identity around being the successful one, the important one, the one whose accomplishments mattered. Acknowledging my achievements would have required him to expand that identity, to admit that success looked different than he had imagined. He chose comfort over growth, familiarity over understanding, his narrative over my reality. I chose to stop letting his limitations define my value. The warning signs had been there for years, subtle but consistent. I just hadn't wanted to see them clearly. It started with the Christmas dinners. My father would gather the extended family around our dining room table, the good china reflecting the chandelier light, and hold court like the patriarch he'd always imagined himself to be. My aunts and uncles would listen attentively as he recounted his latest business victories, nodding appreciatively at each strategic detail. When conversation turned to the younger generation, the pattern emerged. My cousin Claudia's promotion at the marketing firm warranted a toast. My brother David's acceptance into a prestigious medical residency program prompted calls to neighbors who weren't even at the dinner. When someone inevitably asked about me, my father's entire demeanor shifted. "She's doing fine," he'd say, cutting his turkey with surgical precision. Still in the Navy, still traveling around. Still. The word carried weight, implying something temporary that had somehow become permanent, something that should have ended by now but stubbornly persisted. My Aunt Patricia, bless her, would try to draw me into the conversation. "Tell us about your latest assignment, dear. Where are you stationed now?" Before I could respond, my father would interject. "She's working in operations now. Very busy with the daily routine." Operations became routine. Leadership became management. Strategic planning became scheduling. Every accomplishment was translated into terms that minimized its significance, reduced it to something ordinary and forgettable. The extended family took their cues from him. If my military service wasn't worth celebrating, then they wouldn't celebrate it. If my achievements weren't remarkable, then they wouldn't remark on them. My father's dismissal became their dismissal, his indifference their indifference. I began to notice how different the energy was when my brother spoke. When David described his surgical rotations, the room leaned in, hanging on every detail about life-saving procedures and medical emergencies. When Mark talked about his legal cases, Voices dropped to reverent whispers about justice and courtroom drama. When I mentioned coordinating humanitarian relief efforts in the aftermath of a Pacific typhoon, the response was polite but distracted. When I described leading a multinational training exercise involving 6 different navies, my father would nod absently and change the subject to property values. The message was clear: some careers mattered, and others were just jobs people did until they found their real calling. My mother tried to bridge the gap, but her attempts only highlighted the divide. She'd quietly ask me about my work when we were alone in the kitchen, showing genuine interest in the details my father dismissed. But in public, she deferred to his judgment, unwilling to contradict his narrative about my life. "Your father just doesn't understand the military," she'd whisper while we washed dishes after another awkward family gathering. "He's proud of you, he just doesn't know how to show it." But I was beginning to see that understanding wasn't the issue. My father was an intelligent man who could grasp complex real estate transactions and municipal regulations. The problem wasn't comprehension, it was respect. He didn't want to understand my world because doing so would require acknowledging that success existed outside his definition of it. The pattern extended beyond family gatherings. When I brought friends home on leave, my father would make polite conversation but never ask the substantive questions that revealed genuine interest. He'd inquire about where they were from and how long they'd been in the service, but never about their experiences, their motivations, or their perspective on global events they'd witnessed firsthand. When my fellow officers talked about their families, I began to notice the difference. Many of them described parents who asked detailed questions about their assignments, who followed international news to better understand their children's world, who displayed their military awards with pride. My commendations stayed in my own apartment. My father's walls remained dedicated to his business achievements and my brother's civilian accomplishments. The breaking point came during my promotion to lieutenant commander. The ceremony was held at the naval base, a formal affair with full dress uniforms and traditional protocol. My parents attended, sitting in the section reserved for family members. Afterward, at the reception, my commanding officer approached my parents. Captain Rodriguez was a decorated veteran with 30 years of experience, someone whose opinion carried weight in any military circle. "You should be very proud," he told my father. "Your daughter is one of the finest officers I've had the privilege to serve with. Her leadership during our last deployment was exemplary." My father smiled politely and thanked him for the kind words. But I could see in his expression that he was unmoved. Captain Rodriguez's praise carried no more weight than a neighbor complimenting my gardening skills. Military achievement, in my father's worldview, was simply not achievement that mattered. That evening, at the celebration dinner he'd insisted on hosting, my father raised his glass to toast my promotion. "To my daughter," he said, "for her continued dedication to public service." Public service. The phrase reduced my leadership of 300 sailors to something equivalent to working at the DMV. It translated years of training, sacrifice, and responsibility into a vague civic obligation that anyone might fulfill. My brothers offered congratulations, but their tone was the same one they used when acknowledging my birthday or commenting on my new haircut. Pleasant, obligatory, forgettable. I realized that night that my father's dismissal wasn't accidental or unconscious. It was deliberate. He had constructed a worldview where his success was the template for all success, where his achievements were the standard by which all achievements should be measured. In that worldview, my career wasn't just different, it was lesser. Not because it was less important or less demanding, but because it was unfamiliar. And rather than expand his understanding to accommodate my reality, he had chosen to diminish my reality to fit his understanding. The conversation at dinner confirmed it. When guests asked about my new responsibilities, my father answered for me, describing my role in terms that stripped away its complexity and significance. When I tried to correct him, to explain the actual scope of my duties, he'd smile indulgently and say, "She's being modest. It's basically supervisory work." Supervisory work. As if commanding a ship and being responsible for the safety and readiness of an entire crew was equivalent to managing a small office staff. I stopped trying to correct him. I stopped trying to educate him. I stopped trying to earn recognition that he was fundamentally incapable of giving. The cracks had become chasms, and I was finally ready to acknowledge that some damage was irreversible. The evening that ended everything started like dozens of others. My father had planned one of his dinner parties, the kind he'd been hosting for 20 years. The guest list included his business associates, longtime neighbors, and a few family members who lived nearby. My mother spent the afternoon arranging flowers and setting the table with their wedding china, the ritual preparation that preceded these carefully orchestrated displays of prosperity and connection. I was home on leave, having just completed a deployment that had taken me to 7 countries in 4 months. The assignment had been challenging and successful, requiring me to coordinate logistics for joint operations with allied navies while managing complex diplomatic protocols. It was the kind of responsibility that demonstrated trust from my superiors and respect from my peers. But as I dressed for dinner, I already knew how the evening would unfold. My father would introduce me to guests as his daughter in the Navy, then quickly move the conversation to topics he considered more substantial. My accomplishments would be acknowledged briefly and dismissed permanently. My presence would be tolerated but not celebrated. The guests arrived in waves, each greeted personally by my father, who had a gift for making everyone feel important and welcomed. He'd built his business success partly on this ability to connect with people, to make them feel seen and valued. Watching him work the room, I felt the familiar ache of knowing he had never turned that gift toward me. Dinner conversation flowed through predictable channels. Business opportunities, local politics, travel experiences, and family updates. My father dominated the discussion, as he always did, weaving stories and observations into an entertaining monologue that kept everyone engaged. When the conversation turned to children and careers, I braced myself. Mrs. Patterson from down the street had a son who'd just made partner at a law firm in Chicago. The Johnsons were celebrating their daughter's promotion to department head at a local hospital. Each success story was met with enthusiastic responses, questions about details, predictions about bright futures ahead. My father listened to these stories with genuine interest and offered congratulations that sounded sincere. When someone asked about his children, he immediately launched into updates about my brothers. David's surgical residency was going exceptionally well, with several attending physicians commenting on his natural talent and work ethic. Mark had just won a significant case for his firm and was being considered for early partnership. The pride in his voice was unmistakable. These were accomplishments he understood, achievements that fit his definition of success. His excitement was infectious, and the other guests responded with the kind of enthusiasm reserved for truly impressive news. Then Mrs. Patterson, who had always been kind to me, asked, "And what about your daughter? Wasn't she just promoted recently?" The question hung in the air for a moment while my father gathered his response. I could feel the attention of the room shift toward me, a dozen faces turning in my direction with polite curiosity. "She's doing fine," my father said, his voice losing the animated tone he'd used to describe my brother's achievements. "Still working her way up through the ranks. Still working her way up." As if I were perpetually stuck in some entry-level position, making incremental progress toward actual significance. Mr. Chin, who owned several restaurants in town, pressed for details. "What's her current position?" "My nephew is thinking about military service." My father took a sip of wine before responding. "She's in operations now. Keeps busy with the logistics side of things." Logistics side of things. The phrase reduced my command of 300 sailors to something resembling warehouse management. It transformed strategic planning and international coordination into mundane administrative work. I felt heat rising in my chest, but kept my expression neutral. Years of military discipline had taught me to control my reactions, to maintain composure under pressure. But something was different this time. Maybe it was the accumulation of small humiliations, or maybe it was the contrast between his obvious pride in my brothers and his dismissive treatment of my service. Whatever the catalyst, I felt a shift inside myself, a hardening of resolve I hadn't experienced before. The conversation continued around me, but I was no longer fully present. I was calculating, analyzing, preparing. My father's pattern was clear and consistent. He would never voluntarily acknowledge my achievements because doing so would require him to admit that his understanding of success was incomplete. When dessert was served, the conversation turned to travel, with several guests sharing stories about recent vacations. Someone mentioned a cruise through the Mediterranean, which prompted questions about favorite destinations and travel recommendations. Mrs. Patterson, still trying to include me in the conversation, asked, "You must have seen some interesting places during your deployments." "A few," I said simply, not wanting to elaborate in an environment where my experiences would be minimized. But my father couldn't resist the opportunity to demonstrate his knowledge of my life. "She's been all over the Pacific," he said, waving his fork dismissively. "Mostly routine stuff, port visits and training exercises." Routine stuff. Port visits and training exercises. The words stripped away the complexity of international diplomacy, the weight of command responsibility, the significance of representing American interests abroad. Everything I had done, everything I had learned, everything I had accomplished was reduced to tourism and paperwork. The guests nodded politely, their interest already waning. If my own father described my work as routine, then it must be routine. If he characterized my deployments as simple port visits, then they must be simple port visits. I looked around the table at these people who had known me since childhood, people who had watched me grow up and leave home and build a career. They were good people, successful in their own fields, intelligent and thoughtful. But they were taking their cues from my father, allowing his assessment to shape their perception of my life. That's when I realized the full extent of the damage. It wasn't just that my father refused to respect my achievements. It was that his dismissal influenced everyone around him, creating a ripple effect that diminished my worth in the eyes of people who might otherwise have seen me clearly. He had appointed himself the interpreter of my life, the person who would explain to others what my experiences meant and whether they mattered. And his interpretation was consistent. Nothing I did was particularly impressive, important, or worthy of attention. The realization crystallized into something cold and hard in my chest. This wasn't about different perspectives or generational misunderstanding. This was about power and control. My father needed to be the most successful person in every room, the one whose achievements overshadowed everyone else's. Acknowledging my accomplishments would have disrupted that narrative. So he had chosen to erase them instead. The dinner party continued around me, but I had withdrawn into myself, processing the implications of what I'd just witnessed. The coffee was served, the conversation moved to safer topics like weather and local sports, and eventually the guests began making their departure preparations. Each goodbye was warm and friendly, with promises to get together soon and compliments on another wonderful evening. As I helped my mother clear the dishes, I felt disconnected from the domestic routine we'd performed countless times before. The familiar motions of scraping plates and loading the dishwasher felt foreign, as if I were watching someone else's life from a distance. "That went well," my mother said, rinsing wine glasses in the sink. Everyone seemed to enjoy themselves. I nodded absently, not trusting myself to speak. The evening had revealed something I'd been trying to ignore for years. My father's dismissal of my career wasn't accidental or unconscious. It was strategic. He had made a deliberate choice to minimize my achievements because they threatened his position as the family's primary success story. After my parents went to bed, I sat in my childhood bedroom, staring at the walls that still displayed my high school awards and college graduation photos. The contrast was stark. Here were the achievements my father had celebrated: honor roll certificates, scholarship announcements, academic recognition. The girl in those photos looked optimistic and confident, secure in the belief that hard work and dedication would earn respect and acknowledgement. But there were no military commendations on these walls. No photos from promotion ceremonies or deployment farewells. No evidence of the woman I had become or the career I had built. This room was frozen in time, preserving the version of me that my father preferred, the helpful daughter who stayed in familiar territory and didn't challenge his understanding of what success should look like. I thought about my fellow officers, men and women who had earned their positions through merit and dedication. They commanded respect because their competence was undeniable, their leadership proven under pressure. They made decisions that affected thousands of lives and millions of dollars in resources. They represented their country in negotiations with foreign governments and managed complex international relationships. But in my father's narrative, we were all just clerks in uniforms, pushing papers and following orders, marking time until we came to our senses and pursued real careers. The next morning, I made a decision that surprised even me. I called my father's office and asked if I could take him to lunch. We met at his favorite restaurant, a place where he was known by name and treated with the deference he expected. Over salad and sandwiches, I asked him directly about his view of my career. The conversation was civil but revealing. He spoke about his concerns for my future, his belief that military service was a dead-end path, his hope that I would eventually transition into something with better long-term prospects. "I just want what's best for you," he said, cutting his sandwich with the same precision he applied to business deals. "The military is fine for young people, but you need to think about building something lasting." Building something lasting. As if 20 years of service, the trust of my superiors, and the loyalty of my subordinates were temporary constructions that would disappear when I changed jobs. I tried to explain the significance of what I did, the complexity of modern naval operations, the strategic importance of maritime security. I described the satisfaction of developing young leaders, the responsibility of making decisions under pressure, the honor of serving something larger than myself. He listened politely but without engagement. When I finished, he patted my hand in the same condescending way he might comfort a child who had been disappointed by reality. "I'm sure it feels important to you," he said. "But you have to look at the bigger picture. What are you building for your future? Where's the financial security? Where's the long-term career path?" That's when I understood the fundamental disconnect. My father measured value in accumulation, money, property, status symbols that could be displayed and quantified. Military service, no matter how distinguished, didn't produce the kind of tangible wealth he considered meaningful. In his worldview, I had spent 20 years working for modest pay in a job that would end with a pension instead of equity. I had chosen service over profit, duty over advancement, honor over accumulation. And in choosing those things, I had chosen to be lesser in his estimation. The lunch ended cordially, but something had shifted permanently. I had asked for his respect and been offered his pity. I had shared my achievements and received his sympathy. I had opened myself to his understanding and been met with his condescension. That afternoon, I began to see my relationship with my father as an equation that would never balance. On one side was everything I had given, years of trying to earn his approval, countless attempts to explain my world, patience with his dismissive comments, tolerance for his narrative about my life. On the other side was what he had given in return, conditional acceptance, backhanded support, and a consistent message that nothing I did was quite good enough to warrant genuine pride or respect. The imbalance wasn't accidental. It was the natural result of a relationship where one person refused to recognize the other's worth. I had been trying to solve the wrong problem for 20 years, attempting to prove my value to someone who had already decided I had none. Walking back to my car after lunch, I felt a strange sense of relief. The clarity was painful but liberating. I finally understood what I was dealing with and, more importantly, what I could and couldn't change. I couldn't change my father's perspective. I couldn't force him to respect my choices or acknowledge my achievements. I couldn't make him proud of the woman I had become instead of disappointed in the woman I hadn't become. But I could change my expectations. I could stop seeking approval that would never come. I could stop trying to prove myself to someone who was invested in believing I had nothing to prove. Most importantly, I could stop allowing his limitations to define my worth. The drive home was quiet, but my mind was racing. For the first time in years, I began to think about my career without the filter of my father's disapproval. I thought about the sailors who had served under my command, the respect I had earned from peers and superiors, the missions I had completed successfully. I thought about the countries I had visited, the diplomatic relationships I had helped maintain, the humanitarian operations I had coordinated. I thought about the young officers I had mentored and the example I had tried to set for excellence, integrity, and dedication. Stripped of my father's narrative, my career looked different. It looked substantial, meaningful, and successful by any reasonable measure. That evening, I made another decision. I would stop attending family gatherings where my achievements were minimized and my choices were criticized. I would stop subjecting myself to conversations where my life was translated into terms that diminished its significance. If my father wanted a relationship with me, it would have to be based on accepting who I was, not trying to convince me to become someone else. If he couldn't offer respect, then I couldn't offer access. The boundaries I established that day weren't meant as punishment. They were meant as protection. I had finally learned the difference between earning someone's approval and demanding someone's respect. I could live without his approval. I couldn't live without my own self-respect. That day, 200 SEALs stood and saluted me as Admiral. My father's laughter never held power over me again. Respect isn't given, it's earned, and sometimes the people closest to us are the last to see it. What about you? Have you ever been underestimated by your own family, or had someone dismiss your hard work until the truth could no longer be ignored? How did you handle it? Share your story in the comments. I'd love to hear it. And if this resonated with you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and join me for more real stories about boundaries, respect, and reclaiming your worth.